Let's talk about Jordan Peterson. This is a video I've been kind of planning for a while, something I've been wanting to do. I went back and read all of Jordan Peterson's books. I read his long Maps of Meaning, his best-selling 12 Rules for Life, and his most recent Beyond Order. Now, I've wanted to kind of do this video partially because I think Jordan Peterson has become a voice of influence within the Christian church. And so as a theologian, I kind of wanted to have somewhat of a response to him. Now, I'll be frank and upfront about this. I'm kind of negative about Peterson. I mostly have bad things to say about him here, though I will also be clear that if you've benefited from his work, I think that that's a good thing. And in no way would I discourage people from reading books or trying to better themselves or take ownership over their life. And I think in that regard, Peterson's work has a purpose and has a place within the world and within the church. But I just want to caution a few of the things that I have noticed about his work that I think are problematic. So I wrote a long script for this video, but I've decided instead just to go off some bullet points and talk a little bit more freeform about Peterson's work and my impressions with it. I really struggled with how to articulate some of the issues that I find with Peterson, and I found myself really struggling to try to systematize his work. And I think that's something that just really shouldn't be pursued for me. I mean, other people have done that, but it just was weighing on me. So I think I finally decided just to write down some bullet points and give you some of my thoughts. So I hope this video is a little bit more honest than a scripted video might be, and a little bit more frank. It won't be as detailed as necessarily a scripted video can be, but ultimately I hope that it just gives you some lines of thought about Peterson and just kind of my thoughts about him. So yeah, that's what we're going to do. So I've got about 8 points here. Just going to talk through them, and so let's dive into it. Now, if you're not familiar with Peterson, I really won't have much to say about his background. You can look him up. He's got a lot of info about him on the web, lots of videos about him and all of that stuff. So but he is just to give it in brief, he's a Canadian psychologist. He's a professor, but now he's mostly famous for his books and his self-help teachings and his public speaking engagements as of late, especially his book, 12 Rules of Life. That's been his bestseller, and so we'll talk mostly about that, but we'll talk about some others. So let's just dive into it. And so here are my points about why I think Jordan Peterson is problematic and that we should be cautious about reading him. So the first point is that I think his political ethic is unchristian, fundamentally. Now, my main reason for that is his relation to the poor and to the oppressed. Personally, whenever I think about politics as a Christian, my guiding principles are what policies are going to help the poor and oppressed, and what policies are going to help liberate the poor and oppressed. So I think as a Christian, we should keep central to our political ethic the teachings of Christ on caring for the poor, particularly Matthew 25, which really stresses this point that what we do to the least of these, we do to Christ. And so I think that as a Christian, it's our duty to help the poor. It's not just something that is optional. It's actually essential to what it is to be a Christian. And so Peterson's work kind of makes political apathy a virtue, which I think is problematic. And there's a couple points where he does this. One of the most telling for me was towards the end of his book, 12 Rules of Life, where he kind of has this semi-catechism sort of things where he's asking a question, then giving an answer. And one of the questions was, what do you do when you see the poor man in their plight? And his answer struck me as being very, very wrong, morally wrong, ethically wrong, but as a Christian, especially wrong. His answer was essentially that you should stand up tall, show him your virtue, and set a good example for him by your virtue. He doesn't make any mention of helping the poor man. He doesn't make any mention of helping the hungry and feeding the hungry as Christ does, and giving drink to the thirsty and visiting those in prison as Christ makes central to his ethic. He just says that you should live your example for the poor man so that he can lift himself up by his own bootstraps. That seems to be the implication, anyways, by what Peterson is saying. And so I find this unchristian, essentially. The Christian ethic is that we owe a debt to the poor. and we owe an obligation to the poor in the name of Jesus Christ. And a lot of the church fathers have mentioned that. One of my favorite quotes is from St. Basil, where he essentially says that the extra coat sitting in your closet belongs to the poor person who doesn't have it, that the extra loaf of bread belongs to the hungry. That in other words, that the excess that we have as Christians belongs to the poor, that we owe them a debt by virtue of them being poor and us having enough or more than enough. And so that's from St. Basil, but it's a principle that you see throughout the church fathers, and especially in the teachings of Christ, that we owe a debt to the poor, that we're not just in some sort of neutral relationship with the poor and oppressed, that we're actually obligated for Christ's sake to help them. And another case of this is actually back into the proper rules of 12 Rules for Life, where Peterson talks about putting your shoulders up tall, standing straight, and setting an example for other people. And this seems to be a central ethic for him of individualism and hyper-individualism, where it's all about you taking up a stand and standing on your own feet and setting an example for other people by the virtue of your shoulders back and your head up tall and all these things. I'll get back to that point in a minute, but I just wanted to really stress that that's not Christian. Individualism is not a Christian ethic. Actually, Friedrich Schleiermacher actually wrote in his Great Dogmatics, Christian Faith, where he said essentially that Christianity cannot be individualistic. It has to be focused on a community. And so that's a central point of Schleiermacher's theology that I talk about in my book on Schleiermacher. But anyways, I like that framing of it, that individualism is a threat to actually what Christianity is all about. And so this idea that we're neutral to the poor and that they do not deserve our help, that we're just supposed to set an example for them, and then the poor are just supposed to help themselves, I think that's severely unchristian and a political ethic. Now, this political ethic of Peterson's works out in many other ways, and I think one of the clearest examples of it is his justification of social hierarchy. And so this is my next point. I brought up that the first rule about standing up tall and putting your head forward because it leads to one of the most strange and bizarre naturalistic examples I think I've ever read. And that is his lobster example, which has been joked about pretty fairly because it's absurd. It is a naturalistic fallacy, I think, so it's a logical fallacy. So anybody that kind of takes Peterson seriously here, I think it's silly. I think what he's saying is really dumb. There's really no other way of putting it than to say it that way. But anyways, the story that Peterson tells is this, that human brains and lobster brains are so similar that we should learn from them. And so lobsters exist in the social hierarchy where they're the alpha lobster, beats up the weak lobster, and accordingly gets the proper mate, gets the best of the women lobsters to mate with. And so accordingly, he uses this really strange story to justify social hierarchies. And what he does with this is he creates a social ethic and a political ethic wherein he can discredit any liberation movement that's struggling to break free from the bondage of oppression. So I've watched Q&As with Peterson where he talks about protest movements. And he says that this isn't the way things are done. We shouldn't protest like this. And he rejects protest movements. Particularly, he was talking about Black Lives Matter. But I think he's used the same kind of verbiage to talk about like trans liberation movements and gay pride movements and all of these different movements for the liberation of people who are oppressed. And so I think as a Christian that our central ethic should be to side with the oppressed and to struggle for their liberation, not to be a voice for repression and reactionary political agenda. And so this kind of justification of a social hierarchy is problematic in Peterson as well. And like I said, the basis, to put it on the basis of lobsters is silly. There was a very funny article that I thought was interesting where it talked about how lobsters also pee from their eyes. And so if you want to take Peterson's fallacy far enough, you're going to say, okay, lobsters also pee from their eyes, so that should be an example for us, which is absurd, of course. There's other examples in the natural world that do not correspond to the earth, to human world. And I think it's absurd to take something like a lobster and think that that can be a model for human society. It just isn't. And so I think that's silly, but really that's a central theme for Peterson's politics, is to justify hierarchies. He is in many ways a privileged individual, and I think he is slow to recognize that. And many of what he does, I feel like, comes from this anger for feeling that his privilege is being challenged by these movements. His privilege as a white, wealthy man living in Canada is privileged by movements that try to have equality for all people, not just privileges for people like him. And so I think he's ignorant of some of the privileges that he has, whether or not that's actually true, but he may be aware of them, but I think he represses that awareness. And so I think this emphasis on a hierarchical society is problematic, and I think Peterson, in justifying these, is wrong, and it's an unchristian thing to do. Now, another example that I wanted to talk about is his bad scholarship. A lot of other psychologists have brought up this point, where psychologically he's very problematic in a lot of things that he says or tries to say with his teachings, with his supposedly his expertise is in psychology, but there's many experts in psychology who are then disowning him and saying that he gets a lot of things wrong. Philosophers have disowned him. His reading of Nietzsche is problematic for many of them. His reading of a lot of philosophers is wrong. He seems to cherry pick across a wide spectrum of academic disciplines and assert with some sort of certainty that he's correct about all these things and everybody else has just missed it. And that there's this grand conspiracy to discredit him and to hide the truth of what he's saying, and that everybody else has just missed it. We'll return to that idea in a second, but the word he actually coins and uses for this is the idea of postmodern neo-Marxism, which has rarely been defined by Peterson, but I think it's one of the best examples of why Peterson is just a bad scholar. Now, personally, I kind of exist within semi-academic spaces. I don't consider myself an academic, but if you've read any of my books, you know that they kind of exist in the semi-academic space where I'm writing about people like Karl Barth, Jürgen Moltmann, Friedrich Schleiermacher, and I'm reading really intense academic studies in order to do those books, in order to write that. So I mostly read academic works. I don't only read that, but I do read a lot of academic and scholarly works. I read a lot of papers, all of that stuff. So I kind of exist within this realm. I'm not a professional. I'm not an academic myself. I'll admit that openly. But I exist in those realms to some extent. And so because of my several years of kind of flowing within this, I think I'm equipped, probably better than some of just the average readers of Peterson, to recognize bad scholarship. And I think Peterson really is a clear case of very bad scholarship mixed with just this sense of arrogance of being right. And that may be hard to say, but I think the best example, like I said, is this understanding of postmodern neo-Marxism. Now, Peterson has been the most recognized critic of this thing, postmodern neo-Marxism. But just to break it down a little bit very briefly, postmodern neo-Marxism is a misnomer. It's just nonsense. Marxism is a modernist philosophy that has a grand narrative about the world. That's kind of what modernism is. It presents grand narratives about the world, and Marxism, I'm very familiar with it. It has its own particular narrative about history and about the world and about politics. Postmodernism kind of rejects modernism in that sense, that it does not believe there is a grand narrative at all to history. And so to mesh the two together and then to throw that little word neo in the mix is kind of silly. What does it mean? It doesn't really mean anything, which means for Peterson, it means just about everything. And so when he is criticized by other scholars, when he is criticized by other intellectuals or whatever, they are part of the neo-Marxist conspiracy. They are part of the postmodern neo-Marxists. They are part of this big conspiracy. They've taken over the universities. They've taken over academia. And so, therefore, they're criticizing him because they have some hidden agenda. And so this is really problematic, and it borders on straight-up conspiracy theories within an academic world. And it really is rooted in it. There was a cultural Marxism, which is a phrase that Peterson himself has used, But cultural Marxism actually originates from the Nazis. It was Nazi propaganda. They called it cultural Bolshevism or cultural Marxism. It was a way to propagate this anti-Soviet, this anti-Marxist, because Karl Marx identified as Jewish. It was this anti-Jewish phrase that was used. And so you can look up actually posters of cultural Bolshevism, cultural Marxism, and you'll find them all over the internet, and they are always Nazi ideology. They're Nazi propaganda. And so the fact that Peterson has used cultural Marxism and this neo-Marxism phrase uncritically, without maybe even acknowledging or being critical of the history of this phrase and its use for Nazi propaganda, I think is concerning and should give us pause and give us reasons to, if not be outright critical of Peterson, at least start to question some of his motives for things. Now, another really telling example is when Peterson went and debated one of the most influential living philosophers, Slavoj Žižek. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but the Slovenian philosopher and Hegelian philosopher. Peterson, in that debate, openly admitted that he hadn't read much of anything that Karl Marx had written. He did go back and reread the Communist Manifesto, but it's important to realize that the Communist Manifesto is a pamphlet. Marx and Engels wrote that in about a week or a couple of weeks, and it's unfortunately their most famous work, but it's really small, and Peterson's presentation of critiquing it was really bad. It was basically if a high school student was given the assignment of reading this book and talking about it, it was about that level of academic scholarship. It was pretty bad. But even more interesting about that is that Peterson, who again is one of the most outspoken critics of what he calls postmodern neo-Marxism, hasn't read Marx. He really hasn't read much of anything from Marx except for this little pamphlet. Now, myself, I've read several thousand pages of Marx. I've read all of Capital 1, 2, and 3. I've read many other small works, of course. And I can say that you just don't, you can't be a critic of Marx unless you've actually read him. And Peterson, being one of the most outspoken critics of him, is practicing bad scholarship, really bad scholarship. And I think anybody that takes seriously his critique of Marxism and socialism and all of this, I think they should really question why he is criticizing these things. I think it's more ideologically motivated than is actually based on any sort of scholarly or academic assessment. And so Peterson is not an expert in Marxism, even though he has become the most outspoken critic of it. And I think that shows his bad scholarship. Now, there's many other cases of his bad scholarship. That's just one example. Theologically, as a theologian, I know he's been criticized for his reading of Genesis. He has this whole series on Genesis, and he's been criticized for that. He's been criticized for some of his interpretation of the Gospels and the New Testament. And I think all of those are fair and valid. And so Peterson's scholarship is a problem because he presents himself as being this academic voice. He presents himself as being somebody who's an expert on everything he talks about, who knows more than anybody else does, and has read all the books, who's studied really well. But the reality is, as scholars actually study his sayings and what he's been talking about, the reality is that Peterson doesn't know what he's talking about. Most of the time he's making up stuff, like this postmodern neo-Marxism, which essentially means nothing, which is a nonsense phrase in an academic sense. And so, as a scholar, he shouldn't be taken seriously at all. If you read him as a self-help motivational speaker, then that's fine. But the problem is he doesn't present himself just as a self-help teacher. He presents himself as somebody who's unveiled the secrets of the universe. And that really brings me back to another point, and that is Peterson's arrogance. At the beginning of his longest book, Maps of Meaning, he puts a quote from Jesus. And when I read this, I was really shocked. I wasn't just shocked, I was really angry about this. Because what Peterson does is he quotes Jesus in Matthew 13:35, when Jesus says, "I will utter things which have been kept secret from the foundation of the world." And so Peterson is putting that at the epigraph of his book. And I thought it was a joke at first. I'm like, he can't really think that what he's written in this book is some secret that has been hidden from the foundation of the world, and that he, Peterson, like Jesus, is going to unveil it and tell it to us all in some grand, triumphant way. But he confirms later in the book that he genuinely believes that. He genuinely believes that what he's teaching is some hidden truth of the universe. He talks about this in a letter to his father, where he says, I'm struggling to really articulate what I've discovered, this grand thing, this grand narrative of the world. And so there's this level of arrogance that I think is present in Peterson's work that is mixed together with his bad scholarship and his bad expertise, or I should say his false expertise. And it leads to some really problematic issues. Now, and this leads to another point that I want to bring up, and that is really Peterson's incoherence. I don't think he's easy to read, but I don't think he's easy to read because he has interesting things to say. I think he's not interesting to read because he's a bad writer, and he makes everything he's trying to say extremely obscure, and he just tries to add a bunch of words. Instead of saying things simply, he adds extra vocabulary to make himself sound intelligent. There's really no substance to the so-called scholarly work that he's doing. I think that you can summarize Maps of Meaning and his other supposedly scholarly works in just a few sentences, and it's really not profound. The idea that across cultures and regions there are different interpretations and different myths that come about, that's pretty basic. That's basic insight. That's the foundation for pretty much every religion, every philosophy, every intellectual tradition. That's not profound. And the way that he uses Jung, the way that he uses Nietzsche and all these people, that's not profound either. And in many ways, it's kind of disingenuous, and it's a little bit sloppy the way he uses these other figures. And so I think this incoherence plays into the one of the tricks that Peterson uses, and that's basically he goes on to say that people don't understand him. And so when he's criticized by people like me or anybody else that criticizes him, his default response, and many of the proponents of his work, their default response is that you just haven't understood him. But I think this is just a defense mechanism that really has no basis to it. Because I understand his works perfectly fine, and what I found is that there's really little substance to them, and that the things he's saying are very basic and, to be frank, quite boring. There's nothing innovative about his work. There's nothing groundbreaking about what he has to say. He says pretty boring stuff. His rules for life are just like, yeah, that's good advice. Like, sure, it's good advice. But I think it's all the ways that he tries to justify social hierarchies, the way he tries to promote an unchristian ethic and kind of this like political apathy. All of these things are severely problematic, and they're tied in and connected with his scholarship. And so he kind of obscures all the real issues, and he talks in these circles and these just conflated sentences. I mean, just Google some of his sentences that are difficult, like Jordan Peterson example or whatever, and I think you'll see for yourself. So another point that I want to bring up here before we finish is I don't think Peterson has done enough to distance himself from neo-Nazis in the far right. Now, I'm not saying that Peterson himself is either of those things. He's rejected that interpretation of work, so I think that that's somewhat fair, though I think there's some crossover between the two that should be considered. But I'm not saying that he is either one. But he hasn't done enough to distance himself from those points of view. And I find that severely troubling. And I think that we should be critical of him for this. He has appeared on talk shows with various people who are outright proponents of the alt-right and of neo-Nazism. And so I don't think he's done enough to distance himself from that. And I think part of the reason why there is crossover between his work and some of their understandings of the world, particularly in his justification of hierarchies. I mean, that is kind of a central idea to Nazism, is that the Aryan race is a better race than the Jewish race, or any other race for that matter. But I think there's something to the idea that he's too close to the far right than I'm comfortable with, and I think anybody else should be comfortable with. So I think that that's problematic, and I think we should be very critical of his engagement with that. So I think politically that's very troubling. Now, finally, really the conclusion, if there is a conclusion to this, I think Peterson's hard to bring a conclusion to because he just is intentionally confusing. I think one of the tricks that Peterson tries to use is he actually grabs from so many different scholarly sources and so many different academic disciplines that no one individual can criticize him because you have to be an expert in every single one of those things. But with all that said, that's kind of a segue. I do want to have some sort of a conclusion. So I do want to conclude with this idea that I think was best presented by ContraPoints. She aptly said that Peterson's work is ultimately a Trojan horse for his reactionary political agenda. And so as much as you may have enjoyed some of his self-help teachings, and certainly I think it's a good thing if you've benefited from those teachings, I wouldn't tell anybody that taking ownership over their life is a bad thing. So certainly, if you've learned from him, that's a good thing. I wouldn't take that away from you. But I think I would caution anybody who is interested in Peterson or who have liked some of Peterson's books. I would caution and say that these self-help teachings of his are ultimately a Trojan horse for his reactionary political agenda. Now, ContraPoints herself is a transgender woman, and so she has a stake in the game, whereas I'm not. I'm a cisgendered male. And so she has a little bit more of a perceptive, personal approach to this, where she can see quite clearly his reactionary political agenda. So I do appreciate her work on Peterson. I think was very good. Her video was quite funny, I thought. It's a little bit out there, but it was great. And so I do think that that's an apt way to finish and kind of conclude with Peterson. I think that his work is fine. As a writer myself, I don't think he's that interesting. And generally, my impression with him was just kind of being bored by him. I don't think he's interesting. I don't think there's anything that I read. Like I said, I read all of his books. I don't think there was anything I took from it that was groundbreaking or life-changing. I do read a lot of books, so maybe if you don't read very much and you just happen to pick up his book and it's different and it's unique, maybe it strikes a chord with you, and that's fine. But I would still caution you that I think his self-help advice is ultimately a Trojan horse for political agenda. Now, he will say that he's not political. He will say that he's apolitical. He tries to say that actually just recently. He tried to put out something that everything he's doing is psychological. It's not political. He's not involved with politics. But I think that's a lie. I think that's a blatant lie. And I think it's a lie because it's very clearly political in many ways. His first claim to fame was actually in opposition to a Canadian bill that protected trans rights in public arenas and in the way that speech was made. I don't know much of the in and outs of that bill, but I do know that Peterson's interpretation of it has been disowned by the official Canadian Bar Association. And so they've said that he just blatantly misinterpreted it for his own gain. And I think that should be noticed, that his claim to fame is based totally on a lie and a misunderstanding of a bill. And I think there's nothing that really encapsulates my experience with reading Peterson than this story. He misread a bill. He stood up and very arrogantly said that everybody else misunderstood it, and that he's the only one that truly understood the secret meaning of what the bill is going to do. Namely, he thought that the bill was going to make it illegal for him to misidentify a trans individual, which is not what it is for. And so he does that very proudly, and he gets support from people who are against trans liberation and trans rights. And as a result, he becomes a hero for the alt-right and for people that are at least sympathetic to that perspective. And he does it all in the name of being free speech and all this stuff. And we see people like Alex Jones and all these others using the same cop-out to say things. But I just use this as a point to say that he fundamentally misunderstood the bill, but that didn't seem to matter to him or most of his followers. It didn't seem to matter that he blatantly misinterpreted it, that he used it as a way to further suppress trans rights. And so I think there's a lot of problems with Peterson. I've listed several here. There's many more. For my own sake, I just don't care enough to dive deeper into Peterson. This is about as deep as I'm willing to go. I read all of his books. I've listened to many lectures. I'm not going to go back and study them as much as I do other people. I have better things to do, frankly. But I just want to do this video to kind of give somewhat of a warning, give some of my impressions with Peterson. I think, as I've said from the beginning, if you've benefited from some of his works, I think that's good. I think there's nothing wrong with that. But ultimately, I think we should be very cautious, both as Christians and as people who believe in truth, that we should be cautious of somebody who doesn't seem to care about the truth and just promotes their own ideas, no matter what the cost. Ultimately, his ideas really aren't that interesting. My first impression with Peterson is this guy's kind of boring. He doesn't really have much exciting to say. And so I think, as an alternative, I would suggest that if you like Peterson's work, just go and read somebody else. Go read somebody better. Go read Nietzsche if you like that aspect of his work. Go read Hegel or Marx or anybody else. Go read a proper philosopher if you like his philosophy. Go read a proper psychologist if you like his psychology. If you like what he has to say about Carl Jung, go read Carl Jung. You can do that. You're more than capable of reading Carl Jung. If you like his political stuff, go read political theory in the proper sense. Go study the history of that. I think there's better writers than Jordan Peterson that you can occupy your time with. Because of all the baggage that he brings, I think that he just shouldn't be read as seriously as he is. And so that's kind of my ultimate warning, my ultimate kind of conclusion about him is he's boring, there's better writers, and there's too much baggage. And so I hope that's a little bit helpful. I, again, was kind of off the cuff with all of this, and I'm not really going into specifics with Peterson here. Like I said, I wrote a bunch of notes about him. It just never really felt worth it at the end of the day. I was putting in so much mental energy into Peterson, and I just don't like his stuff. I don't like reading his books. I really didn't enjoy it. There was some stuff, I'll be honest, that was good. I mean, some of his advice was fine. Yeah, you should stand up straight, put your shoulders back. The one rule, I forget which one it was, about the skateboard. That was funny. That was cool. That was a good rule. There's rules that I could say, yeah, that's a good rule, but there's nothing groundbreaking. Certainly, there's nothing about his work that merits the statement that I will utter things that have been kept secret from the foundation of the world. I know this has been harsh on Peterson. I guess I didn't intend it to be this harsh. I did really try to understand him and really try to understand why people like him. I think he taps into a certain anger that people have, and I think really that another psychologist that was critical of Peterson, I watched a video about this, that he kind of tapped into it really well, where that he noticed that at the root of Peterson and most of Peterson's followers, there's this particular kind of rage that's under the surface. And I think I sense that when I read Peterson's work. There's this rage of kind of feeling that the world is changing too quickly. This rage of a privileged man whose privilege is being threatened by other voices. But there's this anger that then echoes and creates kind of a snowball effect in many of his followers. And that's led to him becoming kind of a poster child for the alt-right, which is condemnable. We should reject that. So there's many other things. I think his theology is problematic, sort of in the way that he uses Christianity to promote his agenda, I think is extremely problematic. He really presents a moralistic Christianity without Jesus Christ. And I can't help but say no to that. As a Christian, I can't help but say, you've taken anything that's good about the Christian faith and just left a bunch of moral teaching. And ultimately, that's not what Christianity is all about. And I think the appeal for Christians, I understand it, because he does seem to take on a Christian appearance. He dons a Christian guise. But I think it's a ruse. I think it's not genuine. He's openly admitted that, yeah, he kind of believes in God, but he's not a Christian. But he uses the scripture quite often. And I think every time that he uses it, we should be critical of the way he uses it. He uses it not as a Christian. He uses it not as somebody that actually believes these words, but uses them to his own ends. So it uses them to further his own agenda. And he does this with everything he reads, I think. And most of the books, most of these sources that he uses, I feel like he uses them not to actually understand what they're saying or what they mean, but just uses them to make his own points that are presupposed. And so he presents himself as being a scholar, as this academic, but really he's making the cardinal sin of academia, which is eisegesis, which is putting your own thoughts into a work rather than actually learning from it yourself. And so I think there's a hermeneutical problem with Peterson that's important to point out. I think that's why partially some evangelicals have started to like Peterson, because they lack in this hermeneutical awareness. And so I think that's a problem. But yeah, this video has been strange. I don't typically like to talk about these sort of figures that are controversial or whatever. I think I wanted to do this video mostly because I have friends that have liked Peterson, and I have other friends that have asked me about Peterson and what I think about him, but mostly because I've noticed his rise and I've noticed his prominence, and I find myself struggling to actually understand why he's popular when he seems to be saying nothing interesting. But I think really going back to that psychologist, the French psychologist who criticized Peterson, I think really at the bottom of it, there is an emotional rage at the depth of Peterson, where he's trying to rebel against a certain order that he finds problematic. And that resonates with a lot of white single males who have a certain degree of privilege in life. And they feel threatened by the liberation movements that are taking place all around the world. And they feel threatened by the possibility of economic equality, not economic hierarchy, of gender equality, not gender hierarchy. As a Christian, again, I'll go back to where I started. I think that a Christian political ethic should center around our concern for the least of these, our concern for the poor and oppressed. And I think on that front, Peterson absolutely fails, and he fails in the worst kind of way. He promotes a sort of political apathy that I believe is unchristian. And so as a Christian theologian, as an intellectual, all of these things, I think we should reject Peterson and suggest that there's better people out there to read if you want to read somebody else. But ultimately, I think we should reject Peterson. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. I'm not sure what the response will be to this video. Hopefully you appreciated this. Maybe you don't care about Peterson. In that case, great. Don't care about him more. Pay less attention to Peterson. I don't think he's going to go away anytime soon, because I don't think that this underlying rage that really typifies his work is going to go away either. And so I think Peterson's here to stay, but I think we should have a conscious response to him. I hopefully have been able to articulate some of the things that I feel are problematic about him, some of the reservations I have about him, and ultimately kind of just talk about his work very frankly. If you want some more academic and some more like detailed notes from this video, I'm going to link just a ton of resources below here. The stuff I've been reading, the posts I've been reading, the books even that I've been reading about Peterson. And check those out for yourself. I did a ton of research for this video. It probably doesn't show by kind of the off the cuff approach here, but hopefully I got my point across. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.